For the second night in a row, the St. Louis, Missouri suburb of Ferguson and surrounding areas saw looting and rioting from local residents angered over the police shooting of unarmed 18-year-old Michael Brown Jr. on Saturday. Ferguson police claimed an officer shot him, Ferguson police claimed an officer shot him after Brown reached into the officer's patrol car and tried to take his gun. Eyewitnesses claim Brown was shot running away with his hands up. Now, his family says Michael Brown was supposed to start college this week to become a heating and air conditioning tech. For the past 2 days, though, the scene in Ferguson was eerily reminiscent of civil unrest during the 1960s in places like L.A. and Detroit. Protesters, police in riot gear, tear gas, stores on fire, looting. Now, the parents of the teen are seeking justice for his death and have condemned that violence that's ensued. Listen.
Out of respect for the legacy of their child, they pray for calm.
Yes.
Any problems that be going on or any situation, there wasn't nothing that he couldn't solve. He'd bring people back together.
Michael wouldn't have wanted about
He wouldn't have wanted none of that. None of it.
Now, the Reverend Al Sharpton wasted no time injecting himself into the fray, meeting with the family in Missouri today and holding a press conference of his own where he asked also for calm.
No one has the right to take their child's name and drag it through the mud because you're angry. To become violent in Michael Brown's name is to betray the gentle giant that he was. Don't be so angry.
We'll see. There are still many facts yet to be sorted out in this unfortunate incident, and given the racial dynamics of the case, the FBI has already announced it will be opening its own investigation into the shooting as a potential civil rights violation. It looks like the flames of racial tension are being fanned once again, sparking another national conversation surrounding law enforcement and race. Joining me now is Christopher Arps, who lives in St. Louis and provides us with an eyewitness account as to what's going on in Ferguson. Chris is the co-founder of MoveOnUp.org and a member of Project 21. Thank you for joining me, Chris.
Tara, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So, Chris, I know that you grew up in North County, in the area near where this all took place, and you actually attended the vigil on Sunday night that started off peacefully, but then it ended up turning into looting and rioting in Ferguson, where they were burning down local stores, including a local mart. We have some footage of that going on here. Tell me a little bit about what you saw on the ground. Looks like we're having a little difficulty with our Skype connection, but I'll turn to the table while we work on getting him back. So you guys have seen the footage of what's going on here. And, you know, this is, I think it's fair enough to say, is a tragedy, regardless of the circumstances, which we still are under investigation. We still don't know what happened. But when you look at something like this, you have to think, why? How does this help the situation any?
It doesn't, and I think is what's interesting is you are seeing a lot of people in the community also come out and express that exact same thing. I read an article in a local St. Louis newspaper today where they talked about some people in the community showing up to these places where they were looted and helping cleaning it up and saying this is completely irresponsible and an inappropriate reaction because, first of all, these companies that are also a part of our community, they didn't do anything in this situation. It's completely unrelated, and it's unrelated action, I think, too, to see people that are probably coming in. I heard a lot of people when they're talking about this use the phrase of these are people who are showing up at what was a peaceful protest, and they're using that to stir up trouble. And I do think that's what we're seeing happening. And it's completely, I mean, these businesses that they're looting have nothing to do with the event that happened. You can be angry, but there's no reason to say this is okay.
It looks like we have Chris back. Chris, were you able to hear any of the audio? We were discussing what was going on with the looting after the peaceful vigil that you, in fact, attended, and questioning why this reaction actually happened this way, why it turned violent.
Well, I think what you had was a lot of opportunists that came into the vigil and saw an opportunity to steal and loot. I would probably say about 5% of the people that did the actual looting actually lived in Ferguson. There's been about 35 to 40 people that have been arrested for looting, and most of them are not from the area.
Well, you grew up there, and the more that I've read about what's happening and the history of racial animus between the people in the community there, Ferguson is overwhelmingly African American. The police force is 90+% white. Is this the tension there between the community and the police force? Is that something that has a long history? Has anything like this happened again? happened in the past? Or is that something you witnessed growing up there?
No, St. Louis, as you really didn't have a lot of history with rioting during the 60s. Never had really a real history of civil disobedience. Ferguson is a lower to middle class neighborhood that was predominantly white at one time. Probably over the last 20 years, more African Americans have moved in, which it's become probably a 60 to 65% black district, black city. The city is still nice, but you have a certain area that there are people there that have problems with the police. The place where this incident happened was a low-income apartment complex that was Section 8, and there's a lot of gang activity that goes on in that area. And that particular area has a problem with the police, but Ferguson as a community as a whole, I wouldn't say does.
I was just going to say that, President Obama has spoken out on this issue and essentially just said that we should reflect and express sympathy for the parents. That, fine, he chooses on what issues he wishes to speak. But the idea that already Eric Holder and the Department of Justice are mobilizing and looking at this as a civil rights violation before any of the facts apparently are particularly clear. I heard the eyewitness account today, or a purported eyewitness who apparently hasn't been even interviewed by the police. And some of what was being said, just from the perspective of somebody who used to work in law enforcement, which I did not make sense. So there's a presumption of innocence that the police officer, who is probably going to be facing homicide charges now, should be entitled to. And the response that the response that includes an Obama administration statement is one thing, but then to have the Department of Justice say this is a civil rights case, they don't even know the facts of the case yet.
Just before I have Obama's statement, and he said we should comfort each other and talk with one another in a way that heals, not in a way that wounds. Along with our prayers, that's what Michael and his family and our broader American community deserve. That was part of his statement. I guess he took time off the links to say something about it. Go ahead, Charles.
Well, I defended Obama earlier purely in the sense that I didn't think he could win here. Whatever he said, if he didn't say anything, he would have lost. If he said something, he'd have lost. I feel bad for him in this situation. But Buck, just to push back slightly, I absolutely agree with you that you cannot charge or dismiss this police officer, which is what the Black Panthers called for earlier, without knowing what happened. I also agree that Al Sharpton, I think, isn't being particularly helpful, and obviously these riots give it a bad image. But it is odd that the police yesterday promised that they would release the name of the officer, and then today didn't. Now, if there's a good reason for that, that's fine.
But threats against his life, probably, Charles. He's probably going to be killed if his name is released.
But what I'm saying is I don't think the police have dealt with this particularly well. Now, whether it's fair or not, the community feels a certain way to the extent that they're rioting. They said they would release the name, and then they didn't. Today, they haven't yet interviewed him, but Chris Hayes has. I'm just suggesting that there is...
You mean the witness,
the
right?
witness.
The witness to the...
I'm suggesting that... And then today, obviously, with this rioting going on and with this custom of people walking up to the police with their hands in the air, which is silly, but that's what people are doing there, they send in a bunch of local police officers that look like troops. I don't think authorities have handled this very well, even if the cop in question is wholly innocent.
Well, the argument...
Do we still have Chris? Is Chris still available?
Yeah.
Chris, let me ask you
a
question. So Charles made the point that sending the police in riot gear and, with riot everything and tear gas, it doesn't send a great message to the community. But given what the community engaged in, do you think that was an appropriate response?
I think it was an appropriate response. A lot of the community leaders were upset that the police were out there with AK-47s and with guns. But if you look at it earlier in the day, they were calling to kill the police. So you can't expect them not to, be armed for some type of possible looting or anything. It's natural. One of the things that has really made this situation very tense is the lack of information. The press conference that the police department held on Sunday really shouldn't have had it because it really gave no information. And because we haven't really gotten a lot of information, there's been a lot of speculation. The lawyer for Trayvon Martin's family is the lawyer for this particular family. He has characterized this incident as an execution. You have Reverend Jackson today saying that when he saw this situation, he was outraged. So you have a lot of people kind of throwing fuel on a situation where we don't have a lot of information, and the incident is really barely 36 hours old.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to. It's clearly a situation that is very tense, and it's a tinderbox in a lot of ways. The only way you can diffuse that, though, is to say that we have a process, and we have to go through the process. And people demanding answers right away and rioting in the streets can't be allowed to override that process in this case or any case.
When people have T-shirts saying "No justice, no peace," or justice for the victim, that's always problematic because justice is a process, not an outcome. I absolutely agree. I'm not suggesting the police should have charged him. I'm not suggesting the police should have done anything outside of that process. But as was just said, you don't hold a press conference and then give no information. If you're not going to release that name and people are rioting, you don't promise to do it. I think there have been a few missteps given that this is such a tinderbox.
But I think that's focusing on the wrong part of what the problem is here. You're focusing on the police department not being great at PR, not people rioting in the streets, the Obama administration essentially prejudging the outcome by saying we need to have a civil rights investigation. And then maybe the guy did execute him in the street, and then he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail or worse, but maybe he didn't.
But the problem is that it's becoming now a racial conversation and about income and poverty and income inequality. People are actually making excuses for this behavior in St. Louis, where they're saying that, well, what do you expect? These people have been ignored for so long, and the difference in wealth and everything else is it's a poor community. What do you expect? And I think that conversation is one that is going to be a little bit more controversial to have, because I don't know if people necessarily want to go there. There's no excuse for looting and rioting as far as I'm concerned. Really quick, Allison.
I'll save it.
All right.
We'll save it for a later date.
Chris, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate it.
Sarah, I appreciate you having me.
Misfit stories are coming up next.